Thank you, Raphael, for your kind words in your introduction. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Raphael said, my name is Lebo Ramafoko, and I'm currently the Executive Director at the Soul City Institute, one of the largest social and behavior change communications organizations in South Africa. I started with Soul City 21 years ago this year as a very bright, young graduate at a very interesting time in the history of South Africa when we had just become a democracy. Mandela had been released, and like the words in the song by Michael Jackson, I really wanted to make the world a better place for everyone who was in it. So it was almost bittersweet when I was asked to reflect on 20 years of implementing SBCC, and that is why I titled my talk, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Reflections of 20 Years of Proving that What We Do Works. Because it seems like while on one hand what we do is very exciting and very innovative, you spend almost most of your time convincing others that it matters and it needs the support that it deserves. So, in reflecting on the 20 years of SBCC, I looked back at some of the discussions that have taken place, not only in South Africa, but also some meetings that have been convened, some of them similar to this one. I remember some of the meetings that I attended in Bellagio and some that happened in Cape Town. And in fact, in these meetings, we began to articulate some of the principles of SBCC, and I want to read some of them based on a document that was a position paper that was done by Denise Greyfelder and James Dean, who's in the room, about some of these principles. And it reads, to move away from people as the objects of change and onto people and communities as the agents of their own change. To move away from designing, testing, and delivering messages and onto supporting dialogue and debate on the key issues of concern. To move away from the conveying of information from technical experts and onto sensitively placing the information into the dialogue and debate. To move away from a focus on individual behaviors and onto social norms, policies, culture, and a supportive environment. To move away from persuading people to do something and onto negotiating the best way forward in a partnership process. There were other meetings as well that were held, and one of them is the 8th UN Roundtable in Nicaragua that also articulated that the long-term goals for communicators included improved interagency collaboration, and it also wanted to strengthen alliances between governments and civil societies to maintain progress on such themes as rights, gender equity, and social equality, and reproductive and sexual health. So all of these were some of the goals, the aspirations, and some of the principles of SBCC. We also recognized that at a meeting called the Rome Consensus, that communication for development is a social process, and it is about seeking change at different levels. While currently we all experience the fact that whenever we do our work, we are asked to demonstrate whether or not it works. Even as early as 2007, this meeting also shared the body of evidence of the value for communication for development. And these are just some of the examples that were shared about the evidence of what works and in various parts of the world when we use communication for development. Sorry. In this field, we've also had advocates. I think what was very interesting about the early years of communication for social change, or SBCC as we now call it, is the fact that it brought together various stakeholders from various disciplines. But throughout this process, we actually had a lot of advocates in individuals who supported and gathered a body of evidence in this field, a lot of different partners who came on board, and also funders who believed in this body of work that we were doing. Particularly in our example, we had DFID and other funders who managed or gave us funding as Soul City to extend the work that we had done in South Africa that was very successful to other parts of Southern Africa. And we were then able to work in partnership with various organizations that wanted to use communication for social change. I think we will also all agree that we've also had various successes as implementers. For starters, apart from the impact that we have had in the programs that we did, we also had SBCC be recognized as a professional field and had professional courses that are offered at different institutions. In our example, in the School of Public Health, you can now do a master's in public health with some concentrations on social and behavior change. And we've also had an opportunity to interface with other players, particularly in the South, in Asia, and in other parts of the world, in Latin America, and had opportunities for non-formal capacity building. But I also think for me, what is important is that in this field, we really managed to innovate and really think outside of the box around a number of challenges that we are all facing in the world. We've also created brands. In one of the studies that was done by Nielsen, which looks at brands, which I like very much, in one of the years that they did the study, the logo and the brand Soul City was recognized better than Coca-Cola, and I always like telling people about that. But what is also important is that governments began to recognize that the field can contribute towards development. But it's not always been smooth sailing with communication for social change or social and behavior change communication. So one of the questions that I want to pose to us this morning is, do we really have a common understanding of what we are talking about? Often I hear people talking about BCC, and in my understanding, sometimes SBCC and BCC get used very interchangeably, and in fact, they mean very different things. So we've always recognized, and we did that a long time ago, that context matters for change to take place. You don't tell people something and then they just do what you told them. We also recognize that while we use products and tools to communicate messages, to influence or change behavior, SBCC, or Communication for Development, is about a social process of engagement, debate, reflection, and practice. And even in our work, when we use the ecological model that recognizes the importance of context, I believe that our practice sometimes defies what we say. So most of the work that we do focuses on individual behavior and less so on the social part. Often we define our work as creating the poster, creating the radio show, creating the message, which for me are tools, and a lot of these messages are aimed at individual behavior change and less so at the community or the social norms and the broader socio-economic political sphere. So for an example, we now do a lot of work with women, but we do not question why women are at the bottom of the social strata and work with them to place their voice at the center, but we develop tools to make them cope better with their situation. I want to believe that if we really believed in the social and really challenging what is in the social realm, we would have supported and strengthened social movements more than what we have, and in some instances created a social revolution, because some of this process, really what I believe will solve them, is nothing short of a social revolution. My biggest pet hate in the 20 years that I have spent in this field is constantly having to justify what we are doing. And this is not about not acknowledging that we need to evaluate our work and prove that it works. I think the biggest challenge that I have is that we continue doing so by using a method that we know is not going to measure something as complex as behavior change. And we have all accepted that RCTs as the golden standard for evaluation. And I think if there is an area where we can beef up our efforts is to make sure that there are a lot more studies that use behavioral interventions, behavioral and biomedical endpoints to basically test the effectiveness of behavioral interventions. What is very interesting is that you never hear researchers question the limitations of the evaluation methods when they look at the work that we do, but they'd rather question communications. And I think if we have to contribute to the field of SBCC, we need to basically change that and ask for more investments in finding methods that will be better suited to work and test the work that we do. This slide for me demonstrates what has been the bane of our existence for the past 20 years. So regardless of agreeing that context matters in a whole lot of the issues that we want to change, you are then reduced in your interventions to provide the numbers. And as that very handsome man says, the way he feels is hard to quantify, and he's then asked, where would he put it on a scale of 1 to 10? So just to give you an example, at the moment, we are implementing a program which is a major focus, I think, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa to look at young women and girls as a key population for HIV prevention because they are most at risk of HIV. We have all in our papers, in our proposals, recognized that there are major social and structural issues that basically affect young women and put them at risk. And we are implementing programs that are basically funded by 2 major funders. But in fact, what we are asked to do more than anything else in our reporting is to demonstrate or report on how many people did we reach with various packages. So the focus is again on counting. Context and quality is not taken into account. And we have this view that there is a blanket implementation in a community and all communities are the same. And in fact, the timelines are very short where you actually need to demonstrate that in 20 months, in 26 months, you've managed to basically change behavior that has taken more than 300 years to form. And we do know how difficult that is. And I think the assumption that is made in some of these grants is that change is a mechanical linear process. So you are basically told if the young women are in a club and they have discussions about HIV, the quality of the discussions is not as important as did they walk out of that discussion and go and test HIV and for HIV. And if only 2 went or 1 went, then your program has failed. So nothing about that interaction, that social cohesion, that social capital matters. And in fact, qualitative assessment is never included in measuring the effectiveness of programs. In fact, I think it is almost seen as something that people who are not clever enough to study quantitative assessments do because they sit around with real people and they ask them a lot of issues about issues that affect them. So the question that I want to ask is, if we recognize that context is important in change, who is funding the kind of work that we did? And I stand corrected, but I believe that the kind of evaluation that we did on the impact of community and community interaction when we did Soul City 4, which dealt with gender-based violence, was the very first one that was ever done. And I don't know if there were many others that were done. So how are we evaluating and what number are we putting to some of the changes that must happen at community level to create an enabling environment around issues like gender-based violence? When are we looking at how the SBCC tools that we do basically become a point of reference, that they shape and supplement or reinforce health and development messages, that in communities people are more open to communication, that they are more caring, that there is better understanding of the issues, and therefore if people or a woman is experiencing gender-based violence, they know that they are in a community that is supportive. How are we measuring issues like community action and events, collective efficacy, people talking, and people's perception that gender norms have changed, that it is no longer a cool thing to beat up your wife? Where are the numbers and the tests if, as practitioners, we are only asked to provide numbers about the work that we do? So I think another interesting question, and I think it was in one of my earlier slides that I shared about some of the meetings that happened as early as 2001 and 1999, which for me still remains a bugging question 20 years after 20 years of implementing social and development communication, is whose agenda are we serving? I never know, quite honestly, leading an organization like Soul City in South Africa. I know we are called an NPO, a non-profit organization. I know that we call ourselves a civil society organization, but are we really? I think in most instances, we are either service providers to government or implementers of funder programs. I think we are not going to be able to deny that funders, to a large extent, still set the agenda. I think they determine what they want to fund, and we just follow. And I think for me, what is said about that is that it kills so much innovation about the work that we do, because I think the value of SBCC is really finding ways of dealing with existing problems, but actually looking outside of the box. I think there is an issue of the length of funding that we need to be talking about. I also think that there is, and I think, I don't know if it's an experience, but I suspect so in other parts of the world, but since we've become a democracy, when I started in the NGO field, there was apartheid government and funders would come to you as an NGO. We became a democracy and everything happens as a bilateral decision with governments. Now, while we are a democracy, we are not always pro-poor and pro the marginalized. And often, when you receive this kind of funding, you've got two masters that, as an implementer, you have to serve. You need to make sure that you are not too much to the left of what government wants, and you are also not too much to the left of what the funder wants. And in a lot of ways, I think we start with intentions of doing one thing, but you get diluted in the process of trying to make sure that you toe the line with where government is. We felt as an organization at the time when the TAC was fighting as a civil society movement around access to affordable drugs. And because we were getting funding from government as well, it was a very difficult balance to keep, of making sure that you remain true to the marginalized that you want to serve, but you also retain some of the grants that you get from government. So I think, in fact, as NGOs, we don't have the robustness that used to exist, particularly in South Africa in the 80s and in the early 90s before democracy, and we have basically been reduced to service providers. And certainly in my work, all you want to do most of your time, rather than the creativity and the innovation, is to make sure that you filled in the logical framework and the report has been submitted and you are able to get the next grant. So in fact, I don't know what to do. I also think that it's also very interesting about who tells us what works and what does not work. I think what happens particularly with communication is that because everybody talk, they all think that they are communicators. So some of the advisors that advise big grants and big governments know very little about communication. But boy, do they know if what we do works or doesn't work. So for an example, you will see in the HIV field, very, very influential biomedical doctors who are saying communication doesn't work, just circumcise, just give the drugs, and forget about behavior. None of these things are going to change. It's as good as you and I walking into a heart surgeon's room and say, look, what you are doing does not work. Let's just give this person a message and then it's going to work. I think everybody would think we are crazy, but we allow every other professional who's not an expert in the work that we do determine whether or not the field that we are working in works. I think the other thing that we really need to focus on in this field is the relationship between the North and the South. And I think we really need, if we've got other problems outside with donors, with governments, with other fields about who determines what works, how are we measuring, we must also be able to look internal about our own house. And I believe that if we want to be consistent with the principles of partnership and decision-making, we need to ask ourselves in the work that we do about where does power really lie and who controls the agenda. There's many of us as Africans in this hall right now or in this conference, but a lot of us are working for international organizations. So for me, this is one of the greatest things. Funders will tell you you only have 2 years to implement and change very complex social issues and structural issues. On the other hand, funders will tell you even after 20 years, there aren't capable indigenous African NGOs who can do the work. And a lot of the money that then comes is then coming in through organizations that are really not founded and based in the South. I really think that for me, those two arguments made about the same work completely confuses me. And some of the things that we are told is that there is no capacity. And that part of the process is that we will build capacity of local NGOs when we open our offices there, and we will train people. There's also issues of money and governance that get raised, which is about the ability of our local NGOs to basically manage and handle big grants. And quite honestly, for me, as an African professional, born in this continent, very passionate about these issues, I think is the biggest insult when we are always told that capacity and money and governance issues is what makes it impossible for us to get good grants. And I think it's more so because if we are not managing the money, because of colonization, we learned from the best. So you cannot come from outside and tell us that we cannot manage our own resources. I think we really need to question the relationships that we have, because in fact, what has happened, as I demonstrated with some professionals and colleagues from Africa in this room, is the fact that local NGOs have become training grounds for big international organizations. And that is in fact what is happening. So I was also asked, and I must say, this was the last slide that I did, to talk about where to from here. I think for me, the media landscape all over the world is changing. When we started at Soul City, we used to talk about people having access to television, 76% of the population having access to television. I think those numbers have grown considerably. But people are no longer watching television like they used to watch television. I think when you look at young people, they are not only watching even at a television set. I think whenever they are watching, they are also on another device, and in fact, they could be talking to you or standing next to each other, and each one on their device, and they think that they had a great time. I also think that we are going to learn quite a lot, and social media and digital media are not that they are going to, but they are already great disruptors and have become important platforms that suggest that we can reach audiences very differently than we did before, but we must also reach them very differently. And I think for me, what I'm finding challenging as a practitioner who learned to do SBCC in a particular way and who proudly want to say I'm an expert in this field, is that the role of the expert with neat messages is also questioned by this social media. So communication is flowing in a way that if you want to have neat messages and you want to test your messages and you want to make sure that it is prim and proper, I think it is no longer that way. And I think we are yet to harness the power of new media, digital media, the people who are affected by the issues we are talking about, creating their own communication. We are yet to harness that successfully. But if there is one thing for me that we can do is to bring the social back into SBCC. I think we focus too much on behavior change communication, focusing on the individual and less so on the social and the context that put that individual in that place in the first place. Thank you.